So welcome back to you all. Thank you very much for... We've covered an enormous number of issues, and I want to try and just identify some key messages that we can take into the afternoon workshops and the in-depth discussions. A lot of you have highlighted areas for possible collaboration. A lot of you have highlighted things that are already being done. If you had to identify where you think the greatest potential is, in two senses. One, in terms of what I might put the low-hanging fruit. Which areas are ripest for more collaboration that we're not achieving at the moment, and which areas offer the most possibility for growth in terms of research, innovation, and knowledge. Training's been talked about, the green economy's been talked about. What for you are the areas with the greatest potential that we should really be focusing on? Any thoughts on that? Did you? I mean, Patrick, you mentioned in terms of some of the areas, but of the ones you talked about trade, you talked about any particular things that you would highlight as the most important. There's a couple of handheld microphones on the tables.
Yeah, so very briefly, I think a lot of what Kieran said I would completely support, which is a joined up approach to skills development is the biggest near-term opportunity. And I think over time, finding the right model for alignment on accessing new markets beyond Britain and Ireland together.
So new markets, Catherine, which you talked about right at the beginning. The key there, Patrick mentioned trade as being a key issue, also talked about in terms of the British Prime Minister, when they met, talked about stepping up the pace of free trade agreements. In terms of emerging markets, is it about what governments need to do to help industry access these markets, or is there something more that the food sector itself could and should be doing?
No, Jackie, it has to be a collaborative effort. The government have already people on the ground in a lot of the emerging markets. They can do some of the groundwork, they can help with it, but it's like anything in the world. If you want to actually make it happen, you've got to be out there, you've got to have investment on the ground, you've got to focus on innovation and understanding the market, and you can do that in collaboration with the government agencies, and I think that's really important. You cannot expect the government to do this for you. It's our role to do that.
Kevin, you highlighted this as a key issue as well, and in terms of collaboration and working together, what can Britain and Ireland do to help with this?
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I think the government have a role to play, but it's not about them doing it or them funding it or creating grants like we used to have in the good old days. It's about facilitation and support, and maybe the government spending time in some of those markets with their government counterparts. We have found to be really, really helpful to open the doors and to make sure that we're all speaking to the same standards, etc. In terms of what Britain and Ireland might be able to do together, I touched on in our presentation where we, as an industry, we're trying to reach out to universities and research institutions, and I think that's something that we can all do if we can get the great work that goes on in those institutions and commercialise them. And it's the big difficulty between doing R and D, and it's the big difference in when people are working for a long, long time on products that are being researched, how we make sure that the best of what that's doing can be applied to a consumer need. And that for me is the real big opportunity. If we can connect the dots on that, it's a tremendous opportunity, because the latent capability and the research and the work is being done, but we're just not good at commercializing it, in my view.
Also, another issue, of course, with in terms of emerging markets and so on, is the competition for commodities and having access to the raw materials that you as an industry need, those you can't. One of the issues this afternoon, of course, will be local sourcing, but where you can't. Is that, again, somewhere where you think government needs to do more, or is it a joint, is there something that industry could be doing more to help, and can you help each other with those sorts of issues? Melanie, is this something that for your members is a key issue as well? So it's access to the markets and to the raw materials you need.
Yeah, I mean, access to raw materials at competitive prices is a huge, huge issue for the food industry. And I mean, you heard something about it with both the ministers speaking, I think, in terms of what we might be able to do on the journey of CAP reform. I mean, within Europe, that is, a huge, huge issue. And most of the companies I represent are trading on global markets, just as the companies are sitting here are doing, and sitting within Europe trying to work in global markets. Sometimes when you are buying in one currency, reporting in another, accounting to your board in a third currency, that is a huge issue in itself. Then there's the issue of the fluctuation in prices, which isn't going to go away. We are going to see, we expect under climate change, increasing volatility in harvests, in the supply of raw materials. So even laying aside all the issues around trade deals and tariff barriers and protectionism that might arise from that, just the issue of the weather and what we're going to see, the implications of that are going to be huge issues for the future. And I think, I operate more at the policy level in the lobbying work that I do. So I think there is a lot we can do to have a common agenda and a shared agenda. And I think we heard from both the ministers this morning, there is a shared understanding of some of those very big issues that affect our industries. And I think we should do everything we can to support them in that as industry and to help them articulate the vision, the needs and the objectives.
I'll come out to all of you shortly, but there's another...
Jackie,
yes,
just
sure,
want to pick up on that because it's something that you talk about. For us, sustainability. We talked about it again. I think Patrick referenced this in his speech, as did Paul. But I think sustainability is really about ensuring supply. And in our case, with the likes of cocoa on the confectionery side of our business, we have put in place a program right through down to back to farmer level. In those in the developed markets in which we're sourcing our cocoa, with commitments in terms of investment, whether it's through plantlets or education, farmer support, community support. Because the reality is, those fluctuations within commodities is not going to go away. And as the pressure comes through the system, if we cannot support right through the chain, the value chain, we will not be able to guarantee that supply and consistency.
Thank you.
So there is a commitment there and there is a necessary investment there. Just
another couple of issues I want to raise before I come out to all of you. Investment in R&D in the food sector is lower than in other sectors. And I wanted to ask you really in terms of, we've heard some of the bottlenecks have been talked about. David said, innovation. It's also important. We've all agreed how important it is. And yet, sometimes the investment isn't there. What do you think the key bottlenecks are? And do you think part of it also is raising awareness, as you've all been doing so brilliantly this morning, of how important it is? The key differentiator, I think you called it, Kevin. Others have used different phrases for it. Is it because this is a very fragmented, diverse sector? How do we overcome this obstacle? How do we convince people that innovation can make money? Very simple question. And how can you help each other in that, in raising awareness of that, if you think that's the key obstacle? Thoughts on that? Please, Catherine first.
I just mentioned earlier about day parts, and Patrick picked up on that as well. If you look at the trends in changing consumer habits in terms of eating, that's going to require innovation to move away from 3 stable meals a day, to move away from light and grazing food, and that's a whole area of opportunity for developing products. And that has to be about innovation and changing what's already available. You're still using your core ingredients, but you're changing the way they're packaged or the way they're cooked or the way they're fresh or health or light, and the way they're labelled. And that's an area that needs huge work, I think, with the labelling and the pieces that I touched on allergens. And I think the second thing, if you look at the whole sporting spectrum, there is a huge focus from the World Anti-Doping Association on how people have been able to perform in the past, and nobody needs to talk about the whole cycling saga. There is really a focus on using natural food products and using food to sustain and nourish the body, and there is a massive opportunity in that area as well, but there's a lot of innovation required.
Other thoughts on this question of investment? Paul, please.
I thought the comment in relation to Nestle about the academy that had been set up to train people internally was very interesting. And also the staff turnover point that you made, about 50% of people who are in that space in your business leaving over the next 10, 15 years. In our business, we continually find that the best people coming through are people that join our business as graduates, that are trained through the business across all different skill sets. And very often it's harder to make it work where you're just hiring people directly in. I'd say that's probably an aspect that's shared by other companies, that taking, I would guess we're all involved in bigger graduate programs than we were 3-5 years ago. And that for us is the key starting point. That's where the investment starts. But it also has to be twinned with where's the market opportunity. And we're all coming from very different places in terms of the businesses that we're running. For us, I gave the example of the green energy sector as being one that's been good to us. It's not because we went after green energy per se. It was more that we were looking at byproducts and how could we add value to byproducts and researching that. So I think you have to be driven very much by what you're doing and where the added value is, and following it that way as opposed to just chasing after, R&D graduates.
Which links, Melanie, but it links, of course, to a point a lot of you have made about also understanding consumer behaviour, consumer accept what they will accept, what they'll pay for, the key issue of households now, all those things linked. Melanie, a thought from you on this.
Thank you. The UK industry invests over $1 billion annually in R&D, so I think it's wouldn't be right to give the impression that that we are not investing in R&D. There's significant investment going into R&D. But I think it's also probably time to say a word for the SMEs at this point, remembering, as speakers have said this morning, the Minister's highlighted, not only that is the vast majority of our sector SMEs, but also that of the 6,000 new products that are launched on the UK market every year, a lot of those are coming from SMEs. Now, the issue for SMEs, it may not be about big headline numbers, but in terms of what stops as a barrier to SMEs to innovate, it's in part the system. I mean, we have a system that is meant to incentivise R&D in the UK through tax credits. Trying to navigate through that, even for the very biggest companies, is an absolute nightmare, and SMEs just give up before they start. And even if they get beyond the paperwork, you actually find the system isn't particularly fit for purpose for food and drink, because it tends to focus on widgets and tangible sort of assets in metal or whatever it might be, as opposed to fast-moving consumer goods, which are often, you can't actually make the system fit for them, and the tax authorities, when they look at applications, don't tend to recognise them as appropriate applications. So I think there's a lot government can do there just to incentivise and make it easy for the companies who want to innovate to access the tax credits and the funding that will enable them to do so.
Thank you, Patrick. A thought from you on this, and you mentioned the regulatory environment, clearly absolutely key here.
Yeah, I mean, I think the definition of what is in and out of scope of the term innovation, I think, is really important, and particularly as you try to connect what consumers want with some of the changes in, the configuration of supply chains because of weather shocks, because of the necessary global nature of many of them, because of the areas of specialty in different parts of the food industry that different countries have taken. So, for us, there's we try to do a lot of product innovation. We also do a lot of packaging innovation to play into sustainability agendas. But so much more of what we're trying to do now is innovation in supply chain, innovation in distribution. And I think increasingly there is a kind of a base level of necessary innovation in a broader sense that's that's much higher than before. And a current key theme for product innovation that I think, unless the debate is well marshalled, will ultimately be dangerous and self-defeating, is this very, very significant move towards everything needing to be local. And if you think about the achievement over the last 40 years of the global food industry in terms of moving in developed world the share of GDP spent on food from 20% to 8%, with all of the freeing up in terms of access for protein consumption that's been delivered by that, and the imperative to keep doing that as you go into emerging markets in Asia and Africa, that will not be done if everyone has to source their chicken or cows from down the road. It just, for start, there's not enough of them in the respective countries, and even if there was, it's inherently really, really expensive. So our task here is to try to ensure that there is trust and transparency in the supply chain where local is necessary, which I think will ultimately be at the premium end it should be delivered on, but not to go with kind of flippant and often within individual countries politically expedient sourcing solutions that make no long-term economic sense.
Thank you. And that is, of course, one of the issues we'll be discussing this afternoon in the workshops. Question there, where does shortening the food supply chain help, and where might it be a hindrance? Kieran, you also raised the regulatory environment as a potential obstacle. You said we need a positive regulatory environment. Do you see obstacles now in terms of getting the investment, getting this focus on innovation?
I think the point I was trying to make is in terms of the environment we're in, if you look across, when you look across the two countries, we are so closely aligned in so many things, and yet we go about doing things in such a different way. And that brings a level of complexity, that brings a level of, we were talking just about, sourcing, funding, research funding, or even development of apprenticeship schemes. They are so differently structured for businesses to try and access and set up and develop those programs. across, effectively the 4 countries that we all, work across, is a minefield in its own right. And again, when you come back to talk about SMEs, trying to access that kind of resource and funding to help grow and develop, I think there needs to be simplification, in terms of how we go
That's
about
an
it.
issue I'm going to come out now and take some comments from you, but one thing I would like to come back to is how do we get there, so that we've been talking about what we should collaborate on. Other question, how? So
Can I
do we,
just just building on a point that Patrick was talking about in terms of what true innovation is about, because actually we've talked a lot about product innovation, package innovation, even process innovation. The reality is, one other area that we didn't touch on in terms of that's growing significantly in terms of convenience, discounter, but online. So there's an element of marketing innovation requirement. Our shoppers are not shopping in the same way. If you take it last Christmas of 2012 in the UK, more people bought their Christmas gifting and products online than bought in retail.
So,
and that's, so we need to start thinking about innovation as being central to what we do, not just in terms of how we...
And innovation being new ways of doing things, not just inventing
Exactly.
things. I say, I'd like to come back, so please think for a moment about, we're talking about what we collaborate on, but also I want to explore a little bit how. We're talking about concrete steps coming out of today. How do we make this the start of something? Do we need new structures? Do we need new ways of working with each other? Leave that thought with you. Let me take, if there are any questions, or as I say, brief comments are also welcome. Yes, if you want to take that one there. Thanks, Kay.
A question for Mr. Coveney. He runs a very fine
Can you
business.
hold the mic right up to your mouth?
A question for Mr. Patrick Coveney. He runs a very fine business. I think, according to your last annual report, you employ 10,000 people. How many people do you employ in Ireland?
Straight question, straight answer.
I'm going to actually answer that in 2 parts, if I may. 50 is the narrow answer to your question, but we also source about €100 million of product of the Irish food industry, which cumulatively would have many thousands of people attached to employment there. So we're one of the very biggest customers of the Irish ingredients to go into the 11,000 or so people and the £1 billion of revenue we have in Britain.
Okay,
The
so
answer is 50. The answer is 50. You
Okay.
employ 50 people in Ireland.
okay,
Out
thank
of
you.
10,000.
Okay, other questions or comments, please, sir.
Thank you. Frank O'Mara, Director of Research in Teagasc. We had 2 very good examples about how industry collaborates with the state's infrastructure. We had Kevin that outlined the very successful dairy cheese development programme, and Paul who outlined the Teagasc Irish Farmers Journal Better Beef Farm programme. And I think they're 2 programmes that we in Teagasc are very proud of as well. I think it has allowed us capitalise on decades of research in terms of cheese, which now we can bring some value to that research to the industry. And in terms of the Better Farm programme, for us it's a very effective way as well of transferring our research findings out to farms. But they're just 2 programmes. How do we build that up to 10 or 20 programmes, not just in Teagasc but in the universities, where we have this deep collaboration and joint working with industry? What would you like to be seeing from us in terms of enabling you to develop more of those types of relationships?
Paul, I think you wanted to come in, yeah.
Well, I think one of the objectives, as I understand it, is that a knowledge innovation community comes out of this forum. And I gather the same has already come out of Iberia and Scandinavia, and I think maybe Germany and Poland. So it's very current that cross-border working together is the way forward. I do think it has to be industry-led. And I think it's very important that it's done by sector, because the challenges that we have in beef, for example, and we referred to genetics in my speech, and I talked about the Better Farm programme. Our challenges are very different to the challenges in dairy or in convenience foods or in retailing. So I think in terms of the how, Jackie, it's important that this is industry specific or sector specific. I think it needs to be industry led. And in terms of the question, how do we do more programs rather than less? I think Teagasc linking up with IFR is a great step forward, and if that's done in conjunction with industry giving their ideas on what programs should be pursued, I think we can have not just a lot more collaboration, but we can have more elimination of duplication of effort, and more concentration on what's likely to be relevant to industry and adding value to the industry.
Thank you. You mentioned the knowledge and innovation community bid at the moment. It isn't there yet, but this question of the knowledge innovation triangle, which you have all talked about, and working right along the chain and how crucial that is. New structures, apart from the bid, which we're talking about, new structures for dialogue, for a moment between industry on both sides, and then we'll bring government into the equation. Kevin, or do we just need to use what we've got better?
Yeah, I don't think it'll be resolved by structures or formal meetings that are supposed to get an end item resolved. I think it works well for us because there are senior people within their organisation and senior people within our organisation that really want this to happen. And they are the sponsors of it, and they're committed to it, and they're measuring it. If you measure it, you'll manage it. And I think what a lot of the industry that needs to do innovation would not be aware maybe of what the services and what the research institutions in Ireland and Great Britain are doing. And maybe it's about getting out there and letting the industry know what they have, what they're working on. We spoke last night about maybe some of the institutions talking to industry leaders about the type of courses they're going to set up, of the type of qualifications they're going to give to new students coming out. We could all help and guide them on that journey because we know our needs as we look out the next 5 years. So I think actually it's about people genuinely wanting to solve the problem, and by making their services available as opposed to any rigid structure that frankly I don't think will go anywhere.
Okay, so the rigid won't, but how do we make sure we maintain? A lot of people have welcomed today, said how important it is. How do we make sure that when we go away from here at the end of today, we don't just say, well, that was lovely, let's meet again next year and talk about how important it is? How do we build the momentum that the Taoiseach was talking about?
Yeah, I think you have a lot of institutions that are represented here in Great Britain and Ireland that have heard from a sector of the industries as to what their needs are, and they have an innovation challenge, they have a resource challenge, they have a skills challenge. A lot of us are in businesses that are very serious about growing, and you know, I would encourage you to engage with us after today and to help us identify how you could work with us. And let's formalise that one-on-one with individual companies. So it won't happen because somebody in the government says it should.
Sure, it's driven bottom-up, it's industry-led, as Paul said. Other thoughts on this question of how do we make sure... Patrick, do you want to come in there? And then Catherine, I think. No?
It's always dangerous to do this too much by analogy, but what we did in Ireland on a standalone basis and have actually knitted to a certain degree Northern Ireland into it since around the Food Harvest 2020, which did seek to put in place, and I think initially people were skeptical about what the output of it was going to be, but a multi-year, or in that case a kind of a decade out aspiration for where we were trying to get to, I think is a reasonable model for what we might try to do to knit together these themes. I think you'll have to let the industry get on with individual pieces of it, but I think a shared aspiration for what this could deliver around the themes of skills, around the themes of regulation, joint trade, definition of provenance, the interaction of different brands and so forth. I think being clear on where we're trying to go, I think will help a lot, and then that sets a context against which we can
will it therefore, if you set those goals, will it also be important to have good ways of measuring innovation, have good ways of measuring the success? And if I can add to that, a question really, which is, if you want to make collaboration work, what is the key to making everybody involved feel that it's a win-win for them? How do you make, very simply, how do we make sure any collaboration works? What's the key to success?
Self-interest.
And how do you ensure that self-interest, is it again a question of the bottom up? Kieran, what do you think?
Yeah, I think ultimately there has to be a win-win. If there's not a win-win, people won't engage resource or time because we're all, all our organisations are busy and looking to compete. I think where the win-win for me certainly is in the opportunity of bringing, and to some extent it comes back to this, we talked about the triangle of education, government and business, driving that overall innovation output. For us, the win is we get the skills, we get the recruits coming through, the future talents, the future leaders of our organisations who are going to drive and deliver for us. The win is that we are using and sourcing, from our local environments and being able to go out and compete in the broader place. So there is definitely a win-win agenda in play. There will need to be a coordinating, structure, whatever that looks like, put in place, because the reality is, without that, without somebody owning it, it's hard to keep the focus.
Thank you. We've talked about the win-win. For that, we've talked a lot this morning about consumer trust. You also need trust, do you not? We talked about, I think the phrase the minister used was co-opetition, this new word, the mixture of cooperation and competition. That relies on mutual trust that it is a win-win for everybody, doesn't it? Kevin, I think you wanted to come in on
Yeah,
this.
it does. Just maybe touching back on the point earlier on, where we have found this has worked well for us is when we went on this journey, both parties were very clear on what the end destination was. And so we sat down in the very early stages of putting this together and we said, what will success look like and what will failure look like? And we were very clear that in 2.5 years from our start date, if we both invested a lot of resources, time and effort, and we met and reviewed it every 6 months, what would success look like? And it looked like what it looks like today. Finished products on the shelf in markets around the world that had we not collaborated, it wouldn't happen. So my advice would be that whatever journey we decide to go on together, that we be very clear on what the end roadmap looks like from a success point of view.
Thank you. Other comments to this, or can I go out and take? Yeah. Any other questions or comments? Yep, if you could give there, and then I'll come to Jerry at the front. Please, sir.
Brian McGurk, Brand Create Limited. A question maybe for Kieran and Patrick. How important is retail in achieving the goals of food innovation and food business? And secondly, what is the strategy to leverage that, particularly recognising that the retail industry between UK and Ireland is a very integrated one? Musgrave having retail exports and retail businesses in the UK, and obviously the likes of Tesco, etc., having substantial retail interests here in Ireland. So very integrated, a real asset. Is it on board? What's the strategy?
Hang on a sec on that. I want to just see if there are any more, because we're a bit short on time. Jerry, please.
Thanks, Jackie. I was just going to make a comment reacting to what Patrick said about the nature of innovation, and I think that's an issue that knowledge providers and universities or institutes like ourselves have to recognize. It is a spectrum, and to an extent, we can be talking at cross purposes sometimes. At certain points on the spectrum, it's near market. I would think packaging, branding, and so forth. But the real areas I would have thought for collaboration would be in pre-competitive type, dealing with pre-competitive issues, where, and I'm not excluding, obviously, a relationship with companies, public-private partnerships, so on, which would be more near market. But the pre-competitive areas, it seems to me like one obvious area where I think all companies and research institutions would have a lot to offer on both islands is, say, dealing with the waste issue, right? That's a huge issue, obviously. It's tied in with the whole sustainability agenda. There are some very exciting developments here in Ireland. Mention was made of Origin Green and so on, but these are common issues that are pre-competitive, effectively. The other area is, of course, someone else mentioned health and wellness. There's one very good example in Ireland right now, which is an industry-led program, Food for Health Ireland, where 4 of the major co-ops have put up resources, funding along with Enterprise Ireland, and they're very much focusing on clearly developing a capability and an understanding of what are the generic issues that will enable a competitive base to be established down the road. Now, companies obviously at some point will decide in their own interest to pursue specific avenues, but that's fair enough. I think we can initially are likely to get collaboration around those broad pre-competitive issues. And I would single waste and health and wellness are 2 very obvious areas.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's come back. This question, that was more of a comment, question on retail, the role of the retail sector in all of this. Who can, please?
Well, I mean, retail is key because retailers know their shoppers, know their customers, as nowadays better than anybody, and are very sophisticated in terms of how they manage their space at store level. You can have some of the best products in the world, but if they're not on a shelf, they won't sell. And if consumers can't get the opportunity to buy them. and retailers are very sophisticated in knowing what sells and what doesn't sell. So we can do the category, insights, we can do the consumer insights, we can generate the products, but if we don't have the support and the buy-in of retailers...
And to build the question, do you have that? Are they on board?
Oh yes, absolutely. I mean, retailers want to sell products and they want to sell as many products as they can. So they want to see, and are actually very challenging in the context of, if you look at their private label within some segments, the private label are driving the agenda within some categories in terms of how they bring real consumer-led thinking to the marketplace. So it is, retailers are very sophisticated in that respect.
Patrick, I saw you smiling there.
No, I mean, I think and Paul, I'm sure, will want to make a point on this too. I mean, clearly, and obviously, they're a channel by which consumers get products that we make. Yeah. I think that it's a channel which is going to increasingly proliferate into different formats. Some will be online, some will be specialist discounters. Some you're going to see small stores become much more important all over the world, actually, as a route to market for our products, we think. But then also, in many, many categories, and increasingly this is a trend right the way around the world, they have become brand owners as well. So you're seeing a material increase in private label participation, and that has moved way beyond value and discount and kind of cheap and cheerful type offers. In many categories, the products are extremely premium in nature and put together with very, very robust innovation processes. So they're both a competitor and a channel for us, and in both cases I think that dynamic is changing.
Thank you. Before we wrap up, and I'm going to put you all on the spot before we end, but there's just one other issue relating to the skills. It's come up time and again today, talking about mindsets and cultures. And I think particularly of the Irish Innovation Task Force, where they said we need a sea change in attitudes. I'm going back to this question, not just of skills, but of an entrepreneurial mindset, of an innovation capacity. And I was struck, John Kennedy couldn't stay for this debate, but he said 7 years ago, top of everybody's list of things we don't do very well is innovate. Now he thinks they've changed the culture. Kevin, you talked about that being absolute, that change in culture. Start with you here, perhaps. Can we learn any lessons from your experience about how to bring that about faster? Can we collaborate on this issue? What can Britain and Ireland do together in terms of this question? It's probably the hardest one in a way.
Yeah, and I'm not sure we have the right answer to it, or I'm not sure that our model should be copied. What we've learned is that just like any other business discipline in our business, whether it be the sales, marketing, finance function that are of critical importance, traditional critical importance, we found that it's only by elevating the innovation function and its importance to our business going forward that we finally got the buy-in. And from board level through executive level, the fact that there was a lot of us having it on the agenda at every meeting and measuring it, and appointing very senior, bright, capable people at all levels in the organisation that really put it front and face of what we were trying to do.
So this is one of those things that has to start top down.
I really do believe, depending on where you're trying to grow your organisation, if you feel innovation is important, whether you're an SME, a privately held company, if you don't start at the most senior level in the organisation, frankly, it won't happen.
Thank you. Catherine, your thought on this?
Yeah, I would echo Kevin's comments. I mean, at the end of the day, if you don't innovate, you'll die. You can't maintain a sales growth in your business if you don't change and evolve your product range, and that's critically important. And if it doesn't come from the mindset and the culture of the senior management team, then it's certainly not going to be on the agenda of anybody else within the organisation. And that's the only way we can adapt, and it's been successful in every major industry that you look at, any industries. And I think Diageo, John talked about that today. Their growth and the growth of Greencore is driven out of innovation, almost 50% of their growth. So it goes without saying, if you don't innovate, you'll die.
Melanie, a thought from you on this, and then Paul.
Well, I think we're going to violently agree across the panel, probably.
Violent agreement is always
but I
good.
guess,
but in terms also of how you can help each other with this, perhaps.
Well, I mean, just to finish off on the violent agreement, I guess it's also as basic as, there's a load, what I hear every day from all the companies that I represent, there's loads of good ideas every day in every company, right down at the shop floor, right down at the grassroots level. But if those ideas have got nowhere to go and they're not encouraged, they're not going to flow through. So yes, it's top down and leadership and vision, but it's also bottom up and encouraging those ideas, creating an environment where people want to come forward with their ideas, want to be challenged. Because people, as I've wandered around this industry representing companies, every company I've been to, people are passionate about what they do. They want to make a difference. They want to add value. They want to be part of a creative and thriving business. And those ideas are out there. They just need to be captured and brought in.
Thank you. Any other quick thoughts on this, Paul? And then we'll come to...
There's no silver bullet here. Every company wants to do better tomorrow what they're doing today, and that means innovating across the board. For our business, that means whether working with farmers at primary level, right through to working with retailers who are very focused on their own label agenda and how can they innovate and have a point of difference. So I do think the trend, though, is towards companies leveraging off all of the resources or expertise that is that's there outside of their own business. And that's why you have a lot more partnerships into the future between industry and other bodies, as I say, right from primary level up to retail.
Patrick, quick thought from you on this?
Yeah, I mean, I agree, and I was kind of nodding at Paul because, I think in a business like ours, lots of what we do, we couldn't innovate by ourselves without doing it jointly with a business like Paul's, and ultimately the two of us doing it jointly with our customers. So I think one of the themes of innovation is that it will be more open, and in order to have impact, it needs to be joined up across the supply chain. So that is important.
Okay. We're almost out of time. Stomachs are rumbling, but I want to put you on the spot. The Secretary of State said earlier, don't want to see a press release, just a press release out of this. I want to see real results, concrete action, key next steps. So politicians like, when you go and see a politician, they always say, what do you want me to do? One thing. Give me one thing you want me to do. So I'm going to ask you all, and I'll start with Catherine, and I'll work my way down the line just today. One priority to make sure we've heard about the huge potential of collaboration between Ireland and Britain in the food sector through research, innovation and knowledge. One priority to realise that potential. One thing you would like as a concrete action after this meeting.
So I'll say two things, if that's
Two
okay.
things, but you have to do it in just under a minute.
Okay. The first thing is using the government agencies in emerging markets to leverage their expertise. I think that's a great opportunity. And then the second thing is education. And I suppose last night we talked about education. There's also a whole raft of people that work that have been trained in hotel schools and chef schools. That industry is typically at the lower end of the scale. They're very skilled. There's an opportunity to grow that from a food science and food safety and a technical perspective, and indeed working on projects like the Olympics, we've done that. So I think there's an opportunity there, and I'll certainly take that back to the universities that I've been involved to take that on board.
Thank you. Kevin, you're ideally one priority, but two if you're short.
What I would hope would come out of today is I hope we've been able to articulate our needs and we've been able to identify our problems. And what I would love to see coming out of this is that all the government-sponsored institutions and universities would reach out to business and ask them what can they do for them and how can they provide the resources and the talent and the type of courses that we need to innovate in our businesses going forward.
Kieran.
Yeah, for me, it's simplifying and coordinating the skills base, across the countries, really getting us in a position where we can tap into a top-class talent base and build the profile of the industry. We are in a fantastic industry, and there are the really good talent who can transform this for the future. We need to capture them. So build the profile of the industry.
How to make it glamorous, as it was put earlier. Paul.
I think a great first start would be for Teagasc and IFR to jointly map out what's happening in each country and what's happening at third level in each country, and to then split that down by sector, and at that point involve industry as to here's what's going on across the board. What do you think in terms of where the priorities should be in the future?
Thank you. Melanie.
Pretty similar, actually, but I think it's just about different enough to get away with it. So, I would say it's about, for the politicians, it's about taking the joint statement to the next level of granularity. So it is about saying, okay, what does cooperation look like? What's the vision? So I think it would be about aligning visions, having shared objectives about where we want to get to. And that creates the platform from then which there'll be collaboration and there will be competition. Because there's a real danger of us kind of talking to ourselves in all of this. All the people in this room get it, and quite a few people outside the room who might have wanted to be here because we're very oversubscribed, I understand. We all get it. But the people who are investing now and who are talking about these things now are not only creating a platform for their own businesses to grow and thrive, but they're creating the platform for new entrants to come in and grow and thrive as well. So I think it's about the vision and the platform, and then let's take that to a level of granularity, as Paul says, where we can map out, well, what are the actions then we need to do to take this forward sector by sector?
Thank you. And you get the last word, Patrick.
Yeah. I mean, I remember when I started working, one of the first guys I worked for used to say the aim of any meeting is to secure the next meeting. And I think there's a certain element of that here. This is a top-down effort that's pulling industry leaders from both countries together. And I think there's a ton of stuff and natural areas of focus that my panelists have set out, and all the work that's going to happen this afternoon. But as a practical step, I think getting the date for next year's equivalent meeting to this in the diary, and I'm guessing in the spirit of partnership, it should probably be in Britain, and then seeing where we're at and holding each other to account on progress against that, I think would be a good thing.
Thank you very much, David. He's giving you work already. Ladies and gentlemen, on that note, will you join me in thanking our speakers very much indeed?